10 Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 368. Hey everybody, welcome back into episode 368 of the 10 Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. So happy to have you here. If you're a returning listener, welcome back in. If you're brand new to the show, welcome in. This week, we're bringing back something that we haven't done in a while. We're going to do our Lick of the Month episode. I thought it would be cool to break up some of these episodes on intervals because there's just so much information with some stuff like this. So we'll do Lick of the Month this week, and we will do Tune of the Month next week, and then we'll come back to the intervals for a couple more episodes. This week, we are going to take a look at a couple of phrases from one of my favorite musicians in the entire world, Mark Turner, the saxophonist. And since we've been talking about intervals, I really think there's not many people that can play with intervals and voice leading like Mark Turner does. So I figured he would be a perfect person. We're going to look at a couple of licks from a tune called JJ off of one of my favorite albums by the Fly Trio, which was one of the most important ensembles for me when I was coming up as a young jazz musician. Me and my friends used to listen to this record all the time. So we're just going to take a look at a couple of quick excerpts and talk about what's going on. But before we get into the show, as always, just want to remind you, this is a listener-supported podcast, which means the only way that we keep this podcast going is through your support in the form of a small monthly donation. And in return for that donation, you do get a PDF and audio examples along with every single episode, which means there's quite a library of jazz education materials. At this point, after 368 episodes, we use the Patreon platform. So to find out more and to sign up to support the show and get all those awesome materials in return, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or you can simply go right to the source, go to patreon.com, search up the 10 Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, and you will see the different options and what you get with them. And thank you for doing that. As I said, that's the only reason we can keep putting out this show is through your tremendous support. And to the over 350 members we have over there, thank you. We could not do this without you. So again, patreon.com, search up the 10 Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. All right, let's dive into today's episode. So as I mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at the tune JJ off of the Fly Trio album. And we're going to be looking at two short excerpts from Mark Turner's solo. The timestamps will actually be in the PDF of the written out excerpts. So you'll be able to find that on the recording. So let's take a listen to the first excerpt. And this is about 8 measures long. And this is just a masterful use of the interval of a second and the difference between a minor second and a major second, and then the power of rhythm combined with a really, really simple melodic idea can really create quite a powerful statement. So let's check this out. I recommend having the PDF out. This is the first example on the PDF from Mark Turner's solo on JJ. And let's check that out one more time before we talk about it. So let's look closely at this. It really is a study in the interval of a second. You know, the second seems like such a humble interval, right? We love these really wide intervals, but thinking about the interval of a second, using it in the correct way with interesting rhythm and interesting variety, it can really produce an absolutely amazing statement, as Mark Turner shows us here. So let's look at the first grouping of 2 notes. We have concert G to A flat, and then he jumps down and does a D to an E flat, back up to G to A flat. And then we have this little scale kind of thing where he goes F, G, A flat, and then G, F, G, F. So what we see in the first three groupings, we see the interval of a minor second used in two different places. G to A flat, D to E flat, and then back to G to A flat. Then we see him use this F, G, A flat, but then he leans on the interval of a major second when he goes G, F, G, F. Then he comes back to D to E flat. Then he moves down D flat to D. So we see this interval of a minor second keeps coming back and back and back and back. So at this point, we're at the end of the third full measure, and we've seen mostly the interval of a minor second. Now he's going to continue that theme. Now in the on the and of 2 in beat 4, he goes down to G, plays G to A flat again, but in a lower octave. Then we see him go down to D flat to D, then D to E flat, then down to C to D flat. Isn't that pretty amazing? He's played the interval of a minor second, like, I don't know, 10 to 12 times. But look at the way that he phrases it. They happen on all sorts of different beats. He does it in all sorts of different registers. And he's really just showing us how powerful something as simple as the interval of a second can be. Now, at this point in like bar 6, he starts moving into a little bit of a wider interval statement, if you will. But he's also doing some really interesting stuff here. So if we look at the end of bar 6, what we see him do is we go from a low B natural up a major 7th to B flat. Now, that is the interval of a 7th, but really that's just an inverted second, isn't it? Because B and B flat are right next to each other, okay? But he's just playing them wider apart. And then in bar 7, we see him use that B flat to B again, and then up to a B flat. Going into bar 8, we see a minor second again, D to E flat, and then he kind of moves away from it. Now, you might be thinking that when I say, that interval of a 7th is just an inverted second, you might be thinking that's a real stretch, Nick, But I don't think so, because we see him hammering that interval of a minor second. Then all of a sudden he's using a 7th. I really don't think that's coincidence. I really think that with the way Mark Turner plays, nothing is really a coincidence. But anyway, beyond that, I think it's really amazing how many different ways he uses the interval of a minor second, and clearly that's where he's coming from. So let's look at the second one. This happens a little bit later in the solo, and this one has to do with intervals in a very different way. So let's check this one out. And again, let's check that out one more time before we talk about it. So I will say that the second one has much more to do with voice leading. And what he's doing is he's really outlining chords. And again, he's bringing in that just absolutely masterful command of rhythm and note placement. But there's a lot going on here with the intervals as well, which is super interesting. So what do we see him do on the downbeat of the first measure? Well, he's playing the shape of a D major 7 chord concert. Okay. Then what do we see? We see it again, but it's displaced. So now it's on the and of 3. Now we start to see him changing some things. So now he's taking the first 2 notes, D and F sharp, but now he changes the A to a B flat, and we get this sound. So what is that? That's D major 7 augmented. But here's the point, right? He went from this to this. And yeah, it's 2 different chords, but what's changing with those chords? The interval structure. The first one is a major third with a minor third on top of it and another major third. right? Then if you make that augmented, what you're changing it to is a major third with a major third on top of it with a minor third on top of that. So the interval structure of the chord is changing. And again, what you might be thinking is like, well, that's a stretch. He's just playing different chords. But see, you have to have a mastery of all intervals to be able to play all of these different chord qualities as well. And I really do think that's a big part of it. So let's keep going. So now we're on the and of 4 in the second measure. And what he's doing is he's bringing everything up a half step. And now he's playing basically E flat minor 7. And then he changes that to E flat 7. And then he stays on that E flat 7, but he's displacing it. And now we start to see all these 16th note subdivisions starting to come in. And he's playing off of these different chord qualities that have all of these different intervals. Now, I will say that I think he's thinking more about voice leading than he's thinking about intervallic combinations in this. But I think what we can say about this as it relates to intervals is that once you have all your intervals mastered, once you start to put those intervals together into chords, it all kind of plays into each other. Does that make sense? And I love this about jazz is that one skill leads to another skill, and all of our skills compound into our overall level of playing and command and mastery of the harmonic and melodic language. And I think that's really what Mark Turner puts on display here, is that you could think about it from an intervallic perspective, you could think about it from a chordal perspective, or you could think about it from a bigger perspective, which is what do all of these intervallic relationships, these chordal relationships do for the overall bigger melody? And I think somebody like Mark Turner, who's so advanced, who's such a master musician, thinks about all these things. Right? He has the ability to think about things on a really macro level to a really micro level. And it all comes together in real time in such an amazing solo like this. So what I think you should do is you should dive into these two excerpts a little bit deeper than I just did here. Because obviously what I just did was a very surface level analysis. And I could sit with these two excerpts for hours and hours and hours and discover new things and new ideas to put into my own playing using the ideas of Mark Turner as inspiration. Okay. But I thought these were two really, really interesting things. Mark is a really like what I would call vertical player. You guys know what I mean by that because I always talk about the difference between vertical and horizontal. And I think that Mark Turner thinks very, very vertically. He's always thinking about voice leading and thinking about intervallic relationships, which plays perfectly into what we're talking about this month and next month with our series on intervals. So hopefully this is of some use to you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Facebook group, the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group. It's a great place to ask me questions about any of this stuff. Or if you're a Patreon member, just drop me a note there. I will put these excerpts on Patreon along with the audio, and we can get into it a little bit. All right, so next week we'll be back with our Tune of the Month episode. Remember, if you want to grab the materials for any of these episodes, along with all of our back episodes, go to 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get signed up, and you get instant access to all of that stuff. Hope you're all doing well out there. As always, staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.